Great, very welcome. I'm going to do a brief introduction to our speaker this evening. We have Jamie Brogan from ECCI, which is the Edinburgh Climate Change Institute, with us this evening. Thank you very much, Jamie, for joining us and your precious time. And Jamie is going to discuss with us some of his experience in place-based systems change, particularly climate action in parts of Scotland and elsewhere. And I'm going to hand over to you, Jamie. So thank you very much. I'll be here in the background. And if you need any assistance, just shout out.
Thanks, Quentin. I'll just do the screen sharing thing. Okay, so thanks for inviting me. Nice to meet you all. Look forward to having a bit of a conversation with you all later on. I'm looking forward to that far more than sharing PowerPoint slides with you. I'm, as Quentin says, the head of climate partnerships at the Edinburgh Climate Change Institute, which is part of the University of Edinburgh. I'm also the chair of the Edinburgh Climate Commission, and I'm on the board actually of Edinburgh Chamber of Commerce. And I don't say all that to impress you. I say all that just because it's encouraging that more and more organisations are bringing people like me in because of our climate expertise and because climate is becoming more of a priority. I'm going to talk to you today about the work that we're doing on trying to accelerate place-based climate action, which I think is one example of a sort of system level approach to tackling climate change. Just a little bit about us. We are, as I say, part of the University of Edinburgh. That photo on the left is taken from the first day back in the office after COVID, when I realised I couldn't remember where my shoes were and the Queen was coming to visit. An interesting experience. But Climate Change Institute at the university is probably, I don't know if any of you work in universities, but we're different. I think we're different from what how most research centres operate, in that we kind of bring together research, policy, innovation and skills. And we employ more practitioners than we do academics. And we're quite proud of that. I'm not a doctor or a professor of anything. I'm just a person who kind of works around trying to deliver impact. And I understand that you guys have been learning a lot about system change and how you can apply that to the global problem of tackling climate change. Now, system change is complicated. I know that. I'm sure you're finding that out yourself. So I'm gonna duck the responsibility of trying to teach you that. I'm only going to share some of the things that we're doing or have done that I think are about trying to implement system change in order to tackle climate change. So an outline of what I'm going to talk to you about today is this. I'm going to share some of the place-based approaches that we've tackled, that we've introduced in Edinburgh. I'm going to reflect a little bit on that because we're kind of 4 years on from some of these things and where we are now and what we've learned. I'm going to then talk about some of the enabling and supporting that we're doing for place-based approaches across Scotland, and then hopefully that'll have prompted some questions, so we should have plenty of time for a bit of discussion at the end. But just to say, where this place-based approach came from, because it can sound slightly sort of esoteric. Systems change to me is about finding ways of delivering impact at scale. And you could define your system in any number of ways. You could look at industry sectors, you could look at a supply chain. I think there's some of your work in financial institutions, so you're looking at the stakeholder group that you have there. What we focused on is in the particular project that I'm going to refer back to today is place-based climate action, and we've started with cities. Now, cities are responsible for about 80% of global emissions, so that seems like a pretty good place to start. Some of the work that I'm going to talk about towards the end of the presentation is actually taking us more into a rural context. And the challenges are broadly the same. The balance of emissions, the profile of emissions, the greenhouse gas inventory might be slightly different, but yeah. So some of the interventions that I'm going to talk about in Edinburgh, and apologies if part of my slides got lost there. I'm going to talk about what we've done to kind of understand and break down the problem, the system that you're trying to change, and how you'll know you're going to be successful there. I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've done around introducing new forms of governance into that. I'm going to talk about some of the new partnerships that we've formed, because tackling climate change just requires people and organisations to work together in ways that they've never worked together before. And that leads us into the last thing, which is around sort of shared planning for investment in a net zero future. That is just a gratuitous slide of a nice view in Edinburgh, but the journey we're on here is building citywide commitment to emissions reduction across Edinburgh. So that's kind of where the rest of the slides follow a bit around that. One of the first things that we did, and this is slightly out of date now actually, is we did an analysis of the emissions profile of Edinburgh so we could understand the scale of the problem that we're trying to talk about here. So how big Edinburgh's emissions profile was, where it came from, that kind of thing. But we also did an assessment of some of the measures that you need to take to eliminate those emissions, and actually all of the measures that you would take in an ideal world if you could deliver the art of the possible. And we did them from both a cost and a climate perspective. So you were looking at what the emissions reduction potential was of each of those measures, but also the cost. And all of that, you can, we share the slides afterwards, is in the Edinburgh Net Zero roadmap that I've included a link to there on the slide. But what that told us, and this is slightly out of date now, we're looking back at 2020, Edinburgh's emissions, like most places actually, were kind of broadly broken down by what came from homes, what came from public buildings, what came from transport, what came from industry. Edinburgh's not a heavily industrialised city, so the domestic public buildings and transport parts of those were the larger. And it set itself a target to be carbon neutral by 2030. So that was 10 years away then, and it's only 7 years away now. And spoiler alert, we're not quite where we need to be in terms of the trajectory that we want to get to. But that, ambitious target to go from the 2.5 million tonnes of carbon we were emitting in 2020 to zero by 2030, at the same time as growing the city from a population of what was about, I think, 520,000 at the time, and it's projected to be 650,000 by 2030. So, your demand and your footprint owners would go up at the same time you're trying to reduce your impact. So, big challenge. And in terms of the context for that challenge, and you'll probably have seen variations on this in other presentations about climate. We have actually reduced our emissions from what I sometimes call peak carbon around about 2000, when we're emitting over 4 million tonnes of carbon a year, to the 2.5 that we'd got to by 2019. It was actually, but none of that was really anything that made any difference, any changes to the way we go about our business and the way we live and the choices we make as individuals. It was all grid decarbonisation. Scotland, as Ireland, actually has been pretty successful in adopting renewables. So that's led to a fall in emissions across Scotland, including Edinburgh. But that was the low-hanging fruit. Anything that we do from here on in is going to be harder. So the trajectory from 2030 onwards to 2050, where the UK's national target for net zero is, unless we start making significant changes, is pretty much going to flatline. White goods might get a bit more efficient, other things, electric vehicles, all of that sort of stuff, but the emissions won't go down significantly unless we see some more significant inroads in those than what we're projecting at the time. This is a hugely complicated slide, a roadmap to net zero, which I am not going to talk about in great detail, but I suppose just to pick out a couple of things. As I say, we looked at the climate impact and economic returns if you could deliver the art of the possible and unlock the investment in a net zero future. And one of the things that shows in there is that about 51% of those 2.5 million tonnes of carbon emissions could be achieved if you found, this is a scary number, £3.8 million worth of investment in the city. But the good news was that £3.8 million would pay for itself in energy savings in the city over a 7.5-year period. Now, on any business terms, that's a good investment. And the costs of those solutions would be reducing all the time. The efficiency of the devices in those solutions is going to get better and better. And actually, the cost savings you'd be achieving now, since those figures were worked out, would be much higher just because of rising energy costs. So all of that tells you, and I will come back to this later on, the the problem here is not about the investability in a low carbon future. It's not about the lack of capital. Actually, we're told by financial institutions there's plenty of money. There's other things that are about our own priorities and capability and capacity that are stopping us from making those investments and delivering that net zero pathway. But it's possible. And showing that possibility gave the City of Edinburgh the confidence to publish their 2030 climate strategy, and subsequently a 2030 action plan for delivering a net zero climate ready Edinburgh, which is what we've all been working on ever since. We're partner of the council in that net zero delivery. Something else we set up to help the city and to help the council and to help bring together everyone in the city in what's a shared problem was the Edinburgh Climate Commission, of which I'm now the chair, actually, and I'm kind of reflecting now on what the purpose of the commission is, because obviously the context has changed and you need to keep thinking about what it is that your unique contribution you can make is. I'll come back to that later on. But we set out the Edinburgh Climate Commission to essentially be an independent body, kind of overseeing some of the climate activity in the city. The kind of role we set for ourselves was to challenge, catalyse and convene. So climate action by supporting different city partnerships. I'd say where we've had most success is in convening. I'd say, and I can say this because I wasn't the chair at the time, we probably didn't do enough challenging, and maybe to expect a group of volunteers who were doing this as a edge of the table job to do too much catalysing on owning a project was maybe a bit of a big ask. So there's some lessons learned from that. We've also set up a thing called the Infrastructure Investment Programme Board for Edinburgh. This is a recognition that delivering a net zero by city by 2030 requires just infrastructure investment of a scale that nobody's seen before, across multiple organisations, across all sectors, and kind of joining things up in a way that just hasn't been done in the past. So what we've done as a city is we've brought together some of the major energy users. Probably the three biggest in the city are the council, the university, of which I'm a part, and the NHS, actually, NHS Lothian. And we brought them together with the major utilities providers, so that's Scottish Water, Scottish Gas Networks, Scottish Power Energy Networks, to plan a more sort of joined up approach to future infrastructure. So that's essentially looking at things like where there's significant land or infrastructure ownership by multiple partners, where they're planning to make future investments so that you can kind of leverage the benefit of those investments, where they're in areas where there's a lot of social needs. So we've kind of looked at areas of multiple deprivation, looked at areas of fuel poverty, looked at access to transport, looked at travel to work patterns, all of that sort of stuff, so that the transition is just. Looked for income generation potential, because you do have to have a kind of business model that makes these things worked up, and kind of layered all of that together to look at where the best opportunities in the city are to build in that climate resilience. This has real potential. As I say, it is asking organisations to work together in ways that they've never worked together before. And one example of that is, we're trying to do some of the data layers on the side there about sharing different layers of data, particularly the one about future investment, trying to get, all these partners just to sign a data sharing agreement. It's taken about 6 months. So, you talk about partnership working, but sometimes when you ask people to do things a bit differently, it takes a while. The people you're speaking to who've got climate in their portfolio are very up for it. When they get to their lawyers and their data protection people, they're a little bit less, shall we say, willing to be agile. But the purpose of those partnerships, and I won't kind of dwell on this, is essentially to kind of share your knowledge and expertise. It's about managing risk together. It's about sharing investment. It's about looking through my notes, and it's about sharing investment, collaborating, coordinating. It should ultimately be about doing projects together rather than just delivering your own priorities. But given that a lot of people work within organisational parameters, that's all quite new. And bringing the public good into that, as well as just your organisational priorities, doesn't always come naturally. mean, it's part of what the council and ourselves and the NHS do, which is why we're there as some of the key founding partners. But when we start to bring some of the more private sector organisations in here driven by shareholder need, it's a slightly different conversation. And another thing we've set up in Edinburgh is the Edinburgh Climate Compact. This is born out of the Climate Commission. It's possibly the most visible thing we've done, which is essentially kind of bringing together some key businesses in Edinburgh. We actually targeted them. You know, we chose the ones that had the biggest turnover, the biggest carbon footprint, and the biggest number of employees, and got them to make a set of commitments on climate, which I'll share with you in a second. And it was, yeah, so it was unique until the guys in Glasgow copied it. But fundamentally what we want is more and more businesses kind of signing up to support climate action and help to deliver those net zero commitments for the city, because the council needs everybody in the city to contribute to that. And the commitments we've asked them to make, and I mean, ultimately we want this to lead into that shared investment and shared project space. But at the moment it's, look at their own operations, look at the influence and leadership that they can show as an organisation across their staff, across their stakeholders, across even their supply chains, whatever it is. Look at their transport, look at their buildings, heat and fleet. If you ever want to know where to start with climate change and you're looking for a quick win, heat and fleet are the two main things. So, but as I say, system change is complicated. So we've introduced a lot of things there that put Edinburgh in a better place than it was, but they don't deliver system change on its own. They're just a kind of start. So what I'm going to do now, having shared some of that with you, is reflect on some of our current challenges that I'm experiencing, both in terms of city progress and also quite personally, and then talk about some of the work that we're doing and the level at which we're doing it, which is kind of getting more into a national approach to systems change and place-based action. So this won't be a surprise to anyone who has any interest in climate, but one of the current challenges is turning targets and planning into meaningful and effective action. Another thing that I'm looking at, I mentioned earlier on, is the role and effectiveness of that sort of place-based climate governance and how best to coordinate, prioritise and to resource it. And then, as I say, there's a piece in there around, if you're going to do systems change, if you're going to do systems interventions, there's actually different levels of system that you might, that it could be most effective at. And I'll talk on that. I'll talk about that from a place-based lens. So, journey to climate action. Sorry, I think this has got animations in it. I'm probably be a bit uncharitable here because I wrote this slide about a couple of years ago and I had a Greta Thunberg image on it. But we're seeing more ambition, targets, commitments, strategies, which is really about becoming aware of the problem. We've fortunately moved on from the stage where nobody really knew that climate change was a thing. Although, having read some of Rishi Sunak's announcements this morning, I do start to wonder. And then we're starting to understand now, with things like that roadmap I mentioned to you earlier on, just the scale of the challenge that we're taking on. So that's all good. And I do actually think we're probably more into the sort of planning phase of this now. But what we're not seeing enough of is, the action piece really. And I think planning's only happening in some of the cities or where there's a supportive political climate that's driving this. We are about to do a project across all 32 local authorities in Scotland, and I suspect by the time we've taken stock of which ones have targets and which ones have plans, I'll probably find that the bubble we live in the Central Belt and around the cities doesn't really carry far into rural Scotland. So, but what we're not seeing is enough of that action that will deliver climate impact, but also, and I do maintain this, it'll deliver business opportunities, it'll deliver socio-economic benefits, it'll deliver good health, better public health outcomes. And who doesn't want those? And that, I think, is where those of us that work in climate change get a little bit frustrated now. And we have to shift our focus so that we've kind of moved from that lobbying and awareness and education piece and on to the right, what are the barriers to action? And that's where the system change knowledge really comes in. This is some of my lessons learned on place-based climate governance. And I apologize, this is a bit sort of project specific, so I'll rattle through it quite quickly. But we set up climate commissions, we set up these governance mechanisms. You want them to do everything. They can't. They're never realistically going to own and deliver projects and actions. So you need to understand, I suppose, what a voluntary governance group or even a paid for governance group can do. What I am seeing, and I mentioned it when I kind of trotted off all the job titles, is that this place-based governance space is becoming more busy. So more people are stepping up in terms of looking at how they embed climate into things. There are more groups looking at climate as a priority, but that proliferation of groups and organizations doesn't mean it's effective. It actually means that it needs better coordination to use the time, energy and resources of people to deliver more impact. Those 4 job titles that I have and 8 boards that I sit on, frankly, I'd rather there was 2 job titles and maybe 2 boards, because it would just be more coordinated, more effective, be better use of my time, it'd be better use of everyone else's. And I think there's a rationalization needed there. But finding resources and funding for that coordination is very difficult. I think if any of you kind of work in any sort of competitive funding space or work in local authorities, you'll know, and I'll touch on this again later on, that money tends, people want money to be directed towards visible and tangible things, projects and programs, and they're typically quite fragmented because they're bid for through a competitive funding process, which doesn't lead to any continuity at all. The last point is very much one for us about what we could have done in terms of what success looks like. But if you're ever going into anything new, you should always ask yourself what success looks like before you start. Otherwise, you won't know whether you've achieved it. So what does that mean? As I say, a lot of this is still a voluntary thing. So, in terms of making place-based climate governance something a bit more meaningful, you need to probably move beyond that. That governance gap still exists, and it will exist until I think something with more formal responsibilities and resources for delivery is put in place. I mean, I imagine I don't know what the Irish equivalent of the Committee for Climate Change is, but I imagine something like that, but that's actually charged with delivering net zero. It's like a ministry for net zero or something like that. Probably not a ministry, actually, bad example, but some sort of non-governmental or arm's length governmental kind of body that's charged with coordinating and delivering a net zero program. If it's at local authority level, they have arm's length bodies that are charged with things like waste and leisure and transport. It's something of that ilk, but with more scale and more cross-cutting authority. And until that's in place, then I think the gap in climate governance is very much still going to exist. When something like that is in place, I think the place for climate governance is making sure they're doing the right things, and doing them at the right pace. And as I say, I think the biggest gap is around coordination. But the question that I keep asking myself, and I keep asking anyone about, is talking to people from Cornwall, Emerging Cornwall Climate Commission this morning, you should ask yourself, what can you do? What can the body that you've set up do that no one else is doing? And if you can't answer that question, then you shouldn't be doing it. You should pack up and go home, frankly. So that's the question I'm asking myself as chair of the Edinburgh Climate Commission. So that was quite a lot of reflection on governance. If that's a thing that you're interested in, we have just published a book on enabling place-based climate action in the UK. There's links to both of them there. And we also had an independent evaluation of the impact of the commissions, which we sorted through our Place-Based Climate Action Network project. You go away and have a look at them if you want to find out more. The PCAD Experience one does have a lot of good case studies, actually, where good work is going on. It's not just about governance. But a question that's all prompted us to ask then is, what level of system or place is the most effective for delivering the change that you're trying to affect? So activities at different scales, I would suggest, are the best way to enable local climate action. And those range from community scale, where it's so important to engage individuals in their role in change and understand their needs and communicate with them on a very sort of granular level. Local is more where the sort of stuff that I've described in Edinburgh, actually, where it's that planning and coordination and collaboration at a local issue, but it's dependent on, infrastructure provision and fairly big capability to invest. Regional, I think, takes you more into some of the climate change adaptation measures, like probably heat's the more current example, but I was thinking more about things like flooding, which are kind of more prone to, they're nothing in climate change respects administrative boundaries, but particularly flooding is kind of based around catchment areas and things like that. So you do need to plan that at a more regional and a less local level, I would say. And then the national, where you're essentially tackling a problem that's shared across stakeholders across the country, and the best way to tackle it is at a national level, so policy setting and capacity building. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to talk to you about some of the things that we're doing at that level. So firstly, a bit about identifying policy enablers and barriers. We took it on the Edinburgh Climate Commission, ECCI, and the Scottish Cities Alliance, which represents the seven then and now eight cities that are local authorities in Scotland, or local authorities that are cities. We took it on ourselves to kind of look at their powers that they have to deliver the net zero aims that they've set themselves or have been set for them. What they have, whether they could use them. Seems like a good test for whether something is effective or not. So it's basically looking at what powers already exist. If they're not being used, why? The kind of limitations and barriers in making use of those powers. What changes we would recommend would help local authorities to deliver better, to more fully deliver on climate action. And the support that they would need to make sure that they enable their making use of them. I won't go through all of the findings, but essentially what we found out was they do have a lot of current legislative powers, don't always understand them or how to use them. They don't always use them. They're not always coordinated between national and local level. They sometimes conflict with each other, which is not ideal. And there are also a lot of broader sort of non-legislative challenges. I was talking earlier on about that competitive funding environment. There's some scary statistics like UK local authorities, might even just be Scottish local authorities, spend £63 million a year just bidding for competitive funds, which is certainly not what I want my council tax to be going on. And yeah, coordination between local and national government. The way funding is settled for local authorities, the very few work there is on an annual basis. When you're trying to tackle something that's as long term as climate change, or frankly longer term than anything, it's just a year. It's just crazy. It just doesn't work. You just can't plan for the future at all. So that in the net zero context, it just makes it really, really hard. So they need to tackle some of that. So our recommendations were need to do a bit more about their own legislative, actually asked for some new legislative powers, the ability to generate revenue, the ability to introduce things like transient visitor levies, the ability to introduce emissions penalties, like low emission zones. They didn't have the powers to put them in place in Scotland, and they are about to. Stuff around money, stuff around that, the fact that national policies and local policies, given that they're all supposed to be in it together, were contradicting each other, was just crazy. So the bit of clarity around that we've asked for. And then we need to make sure that local authorities have the skills, expertise and capacity actually to deliver, to understand and deliver climate change and to embed it into their decision making. And it all needs to be coordinated. There's a lot in that. But in terms of kind of system change, that felt like where you need to be tackling the system. Now going to talk about these two things together, actually, which are essentially capability and capacity, kind of picking up on that last point there, and embedding climate impact into decision making. Now, this sounds a bit like setting up a spy service. It's not intended as that, but the thing that I'm going to be working on for probably the next 3 years is establishing a national climate intelligence service for Scotland. And do ask me questions about this because it's my pet topic at the moment. So Scotland set a national legally binding target, or I think it's still probably the most ambitious legally binding national target for climate change in the world, to be net zero by 2045. Local authorities have, and I commend them for this, have set targets for and are leading strategies for area-wide emissions reduction. They're taking on a problem that's not theirs to solve. They're probably responsible for about 3 to 5% of emissions in any given area. But they've said, you know, right, we're going to lead area-wide emissions reduction across all of the people and organisations that fall within our administrative boundary, and that's huge. And they can't deliver that. So the problem is, you know, several problems. But local authorities just don't have the tools, data, skills, knowledge, confidence to deliver these strategies effectively, and they don't embed into their own decision making, let alone with their local partners. And they all 32 local authorities share this problem. There is no point in doing this 32 times in 32 different ways across 32 local authorities across Scotland. So we've articulated that to Scottish Government, to anyone who'll listen, frankly, and they have listened, because we've proposed the solution to establish this National Climate Intelligence Service to support local authorities to target and implement this area-wide emissions reduction programs. What it'll do is it'll build a national data set. It'll, you know, evaluate and embed the best tools and techniques for using climate data insights to inform decision making across Scotland. It is about that embedding climate impact into decision making, but it is not, and I do have to communicate this to people quite a lot. It's not a data project. It uses a data set. It will have a national data set with some consistent guidelines to use it in order to inform decisions and tell people about, you know, the climate impact and the costs of any project or program that they're trying to build, and stack all those up against their net zero targets and tell them whether they're ahead or behind. Ahead would be nice, but nobody is, so they'll all be behind. I'll tell them how much they're behind and then what they need to do and what emission sources they need to target. But fundamentally, it's actually about building capacity and knowledge amongst all the local authorities so that they can credibly and coherently lead that local authority, that delivery of net zero, because all places in Scotland need to get there, otherwise we can't deliver our national targets. And that's a real opportunity, I think, for Scotland to lead the way, and to lead the way for Scotland. So yeah, we've got a lot of traction behind that. Probably not enough money and not enough people, but we've got a lot of traction behind that. Our delivery model, you don't really need to know that, but essentially it's a kind of hub and spoke. So it's a centralised service, but connecting to all the local authorities. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is mobilising place-based climate investment. Talked about earlier on when I had that huge complicated roadmap slide on. What I was saying then is that the challenge is not the availability of capital, or that you know, investing in climate isn't a good investment. That there are other things that are getting in the way. So I'll kind of touch on some of that in a second, but just a couple of figures. So, you know, in Scotland, the SIT Committee for Climate Change has worked out you'll need about £5.3 billion per year of investment in Scotland by 2030 to deliver not just net zero, actually, that's just to achieve the Scottish Government's interim target of 75% reduction by 2030, which is also pretty scary. But there's work done that shows that if you adopt a place-based approach, you get more returns and more efficient, more effective by a considerable factor, actually. And I was at a conference in London a couple of weeks ago, which Chris Skidmore was speaking at. He was quoting this report. It just shows that if you, some of the statistics down there, you know, you get twice as much benefits if you take a more place-based approach, and your investment is probably well, what are we at? Not quite half, but it's maybe 60% of the investment you need to deliver it. So just a huge saving and a hugely better return if you take that more place-based approach. Why I don't think it happens at the moment is because, well, as I say, systems change is complicated, and this is one example of it. That investment talk, that investment challenge and that investment opportunity I've talked about is essentially about aggregating up investment from multiple sources to deliver multiple benefits. And I won't go through this line by line, but you're kind of trying to bring together investment from people in their own homes, people borrowing to invest in their own assets, businesses investing in their local properties, public funding, which everybody seems to think is going to solve all of it and just can't. And the big wall of money comes from the institutional investors, such as things like pension funds or banks or whatever, for investing at that institutional level. And they all do want to make that investment, but they're all looking for very different returns. So some of the sort of outcomes of a sustainable place, I mean, it's all the stuff you would want. You want your place to be more resilient. You want more wealth in your community. You want more evenly distributed wealth in your community, not just more wealth in your community. You'd want that net zero transition. You'd want equality, opportunity, more health and well-being, more nature, more biodiversity, all of that. But mixing those two things together so that you can secure the investment from those multiple sources in those complex outcomes is as yet quite difficult because there aren't proven business models. If you go to an institutional investor and say, invest in sustainability, they'll head for a proven business model every time, which is why you see a lot of investment in offshore renewables, probably just the fixed offshore renewables rather than the floating, because even that's a little bit tentative for them because it's not quite proven. So there's a big gap in there, and I think that gap is around capability and capacity. It's around the knowledge, the tools, the resources to take all of these projects and programs that are coming forward from a business or a community or a local authority or even a national government, actually, who are looking to stimulate investment for net zero and bringing them forward to the various financial institutions who have the capability to aggregate some of this stuff. And they might be aggregating some of that investment from some of those individuals. You could get really technical about this, and I'm not the person because I don't have the technical knowledge, but this to me is one of the big system level challenges at the moment. It's nobody's job to bring forward that pipeline of projects to show that those are in fact investable, to consolidate them so that you can get to the scale, and this is getting more into your institutional investment space, and to connect them to different sources of finance so you unlock that investment place and you get all the benefits. And at the moment, because we're not cracking that, UK PLC is falling behind a little bit in terms of its global competitiveness. America's got, I forget what it's called, a big fund that they've set up that Joe Biden's announced, and Europe's ahead of us as well. And sadly, we've left the European Union, unlike you guys. So those are the things that I wanted to share with you around some of our interventions in system change at a place-based level and what we've done with them. As I say, system change is complicated. So, I don't claim to have all of those things that we're doing are the best things. I don't claim we're doing them in the best way, but I hope they prompt a little bit of discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions on them. That's my contact details. Those are the various reports that I've mentioned in the presentation. I will now go into discussion while I figure out how to stop screen sharing.